Jordan Cole was 36 years old, and for 9 years she had been the kind of wife that people in her husband's circle described as supportive, which was the word they used when they meant unremarkable. She drove a used Camry, the color of old concrete. She wore her hair in a low bun most days and bought her work clothes from the clearance rack, because she had learned early that the quality of a thing mattered far more than what it announced about itself. Her husband, Darnell Cole, worked in business development at a mid-size marketing firm in Atlanta, and his colleagues knew Jordan as Quiet Jordan, the woman who came to the holiday party and stood near the appetizer table and smiled, and did not require the room to notice her. Darnell had spent 7 months building his exit while sharing her bed, still asking what she wanted for dinner, still using the joint account she contributed to every month, still presenting to the world the face of a man in a stable marriage while privately arranging a future with his boss, a woman named Vivienne Cross, who owned the firm outright and whose family had held commercial real estate in Buckhead for 3 generations. Darnell had done his arithmetic. He had looked at Jordan's Camry and her clearance rack blazers and the modest way she moved through every room, and he had decided he understood what she was worth. He was off by $31 million. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning with a note from his attorney that described the division of assets in language designed to sound fair. He had retained the house, the cars, and a settlement figure drawn from the joint account that he apparently believed represented the full picture of what there was to divide. What Darnell never thought to ask, not once in 9 years, was why Jordan's business calls always came from a line he did not recognize, or whose name appeared on the holding company that owned the building where his own firm leased its office space. What happened in that conference room 4 weeks later would cost Darnell Cole every assumption he had been standing on. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came through the windows of the home office, the way it always did in September in Atlanta, deliberate and warm, finding the surface of the walnut bookshelves Jordan had built herself the summer after her grandfather passed, running her hands along the grain on 100 August evenings in the garage workshop until the finish was something she could be satisfied with. She ran her palm along the nearest shelf now, the way she did every morning before she sat down, a ritual so small she had stopped noticing she did it. The shelves held the engineering and architecture texts from her graduate program, the bound financial reports from the past 4 fiscal years, and a framed photograph of her grandfather at a job site in 1979, wearing a hard hat and looking at something off camera with the expression of a man who had already calculated exactly what was required. She sat with her coffee and opened her laptop and moved through the first hour of the morning the way she moved through everything, methodically, without wasted motion, one item fully resolved before the next one was opened. Her grandfather, Thomas Cole, had been a civil engineer in Memphis for 35 years and had retired to Atlanta when Jordan was 12, which meant she had spent her most formative years watching a man who built things for a living apply that same precision to everything else. He had taught her to read a blueprint before she could read a spreadsheet. He had told her, more times than she could count, pressing his hand flat on whatever surface was between them, the most dangerous thing a person can do is let someone else measure your value. You keep that measurement yourself. He had been gone 6 years. She heard him almost every morning, and the particular quality of the early light. She had met Darnell at a mutual friend's cookout in Virginia Beach 9 years ago, when she was 27 and 2 years into building the company that no one at that cookout knew she was building. He had arrived late, which she noticed, and had immediately found the center of the gathering, which she also noticed, and had made his way across the yard to introduce himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never in his adult life had to wonder whether he would be well received. He was warm and funny, and he had a way of looking at people when they spoke that made them feel like the only person in the room, a quality she had loved genuinely in the early years and had later come to understand was not the same as actually finding people interesting, but was instead a social fluency, practiced and effective, and only as deep as it needed to be to accomplish its purpose. She had loved him with the open-handed certainty of a woman who had not yet been given a reason to audit the structure of something she was standing inside. They married after a year. She had been careful, in the way her grandfather had raised her to be careful, about keeping the company's legal identity clean and separate from the marital estate, not from suspicion, but from the same instinct that made her check the load calculations twice on every project. Because sound structures required sound documentation from the first day of construction, not on the day you needed to prove what they were built to hold. Darnell had known she ran a company. He had known it in the way people know things they have decided not to examine closely. She described it as a consulting operation, which was accurate as far as it went, and he accepted that description without pressing for specifics, because it had not occurred to him that specifics would matter. She had watched him, not ask, for 9 years, with the patient attention of a woman who understood that what people chose not to inquire about was as informative as anything they said. The first change arrived 7 months ago. Not dramatic. A frequency shift, the kind of thing that reads as nothing in a single observation and as a clear signal across a pattern. He began putting his phone face down on surfaces when it was within her field of view. He started staying late on Tuesdays and Thursdays with a regularity that had a specific, unhurried quality to it, as though the schedule had been agreed upon in advance with someone who had their own calendar to manage. He mentioned Vivienne Cross by name 4 times across 3 months, always in a professional context, always with a warmth of register that professional contexts did not require. He began choosing his words in conversation with a carefulness that had not been there before, the way a man chooses his words when he is maintaining 2 versions of the same story simultaneously and does not want them to touch. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. She began keeping a closer record of the things she could verify, and she waited, with the patience of someone who understood that a structural assessment is only useful when it is complete. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. She had always had better uses for the investment. The discovery came on a Tuesday evening in October, through a door she had not opened and a conversation she had not looked for. She had come home from a site visit 40 minutes earlier than expected, a survey that had concluded ahead of schedule because the subcontractor had done their preparation correctly for once, and she had walked through the back entrance into the kitchen and started toward the hallway when she heard, through the study door that was not fully closed, Darnell's voice at a register she had not heard him use in a long time. Lower than his usual tone, more deliberate in its pacing, the kind of careful that belongs to someone who is selecting each word before they release it, managing what they say to someone they need to manage. She heard the name Vivienne. She heard the phrase "before I file." She did not hear what followed, because by that point she had already stopped walking and was standing very still in the hallway, not from shock. She had been half expecting a version of this for 3 months, but from the particular stillness that comes over a person when something they have been quietly preparing for finally arrives and announces itself. She did not open the door. Her hands did not shake. She walked back to the kitchen and drew a glass of water and stood at the sink and looked out at the yard she had planted herself 3 years ago, the garden her grandfather would have approved of. No ornamentals. Only things that produced something. Tomatoes, herbs, 2 rows of collards that did not require much attention once they were established, which was the kind of plant she had always preferred. She stood there until she heard Darnell's study chair shift, and the sound of the call ending. Then she went upstairs and changed out of her work clothes and came back down and began making dinner, and when he came out of the study he kissed her cheek and asked how the site visit had gone, and she told him the true and sufficient version of how it had gone. And they ate, and neither of them said anything that mattered. And she went to bed when she usually went to bed and lay in the dark, and let the full shape of the situation arrange itself in her mind with the unhurried clarity she had always brought to a structural problem. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She spent the following 3 days in the mode she had developed over 15 years of professional practice for moments when a structure revealed a deficiency she needed to fully map before she addressed it. Gather everything, touch nothing. Verify the complete picture first. She pulled 3 years of joint bank statements and cross-referenced them against the household expense records she had maintained in the same spreadsheet since the first year of the marriage. 4 months of withdrawals in amounts small enough to avoid automatic notice, totaling just under $19,000, did not correspond with any household expense she could account for. She requested the full credit report and found a secondary card in Darnell's name with 12 months of charges. Restaurants she did not recognize. 2 hotels. A jeweler in Buckhead whose name she recognized from a neighborhood she rarely visited. She photographed every page with the methodical attention of a woman who understood the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it, and she created a folder on her encrypted drive and named it with the date and sealed it. Then she made the call she had been holding for 48 hours. "Uncle Raymond," she said when he answered. "I need to see you this weekend. It is time." He did not ask what time it was for. He had been waiting for 9 years, in the steady, unhurried way of a man who had helped Thomas Cole build a legal framework around his granddaughter's company and had understood from the beginning what that framework was ultimately for. Jordan's quiet was not a limitation, he had told Thomas once, over a long lunch in Atlanta when she was still in graduate school. Thomas had pressed his hand flat on the table and said, "No. It is a preparation," and they had left it at that, because both of them already knew it was true. Raymond Cole was 69 years old and had been a corporate attorney in Atlanta for 37 years before stepping back from daily practice to serve as outside counsel to a small number of clients he trusted and whose work he believed in. Jordan was among them. He had been advising her, at Thomas's specific request and then at her own, since she incorporated the company 11 years ago in a small office above a dry cleaner in Decatur. He knew the corporate structure the way he knew his own handwriting. He knew every subsidiary, every holding entity, every lease and contract and board resolution. He had advised her from the beginning to maintain complete legal separation between her personal finances and the company. Not because he anticipated this specific scenario, but because Thomas Cole had told him once that his granddaughter would be underestimated at some point in her life by someone who mattered to her, and that when that day came, she should have nothing left to build, and everything already standing. They met at his office on Sunday morning. Jordan placed the documentation folder on his desk, and he reviewed it with the attention of a man reading a brief for which he had already anticipated most of the conclusions. He made 4 notes. Then he looked up. The settlement he accepted, Raymond said, was drawn from the joint account and the marital assets. His attorney prepared it on the assumption that the joint account represented the full scope of the marital estate. His attorney prepared it on the information Darnell gave him, Jordan said. Darnell gave him the information he had. Raymond looked at her for a long moment. He was in that building for 3 years, he said. He used the parking structure. He attended events in the lobby. He never asked whose name was on the lease. He never asked, Jordan confirmed. Raymond set his pen down. "Then let me tell you what the counterfiling is going to look like. And then let me tell you what happens in that conference room when his attorney sees it for the first time. Real power operated in quiet rooms. Over the following 2 weeks, Raymond filed the counter-documentation with the precision he had spent 37 years developing. The company, formally incorporated as Cole Meridian Holdings, LLC, with 3 active subsidiaries, 11 employees and contracts in 4 states, had been founded 11 years ago, 3 years before the marriage, with seed capital from Thomas Cole's estate and Jordan's graduate school savings. Every contribution was dated. Every account was separate. Every entity had been maintained with the documentary cleanliness of an organization that had been advised from inception by a man who anticipated the day it would need to prove its independence. The building Darnell's firm leased its office space from was owned by a Cole Meridian subsidiary. He had signed a lease renewal 8 months ago and not recognized the holding entity's name. He had attended the firm's holiday party in that building for 6 years and shaken hands with a property manager who reported to a woman who sat across his dinner table every evening. The company's current valuation, established by an independent firm for a recent investor disclosure, was $31 million. Jordan spent those 2 weeks the way she spent every working week. She ran her morning reviews. She attended her site visits. She drove the Camry and wore the clearance rack blazers and answered Darnell's evening questions about her day with the same unvarying calm she had maintained for 9 years, because there was no strategic advantage in letting him understand what was coming before it arrived. He had already filed. The process was in motion. What remained was the room where it concluded, and she intended to be fully prepared for that room. She called her closest friend, a woman named Adeze, who had known Jordan since graduate school and who had run the company's operations division from the beginning. She told her what was happening in 3 sentences. Adeze was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Do you need me there?" "Raymond will handle it," Jordan said. "But I want you to know." "He leased your building for 3 years," Adeze said, and never wondered. "He saw what he decided to see," Jordan said. "That was always his choice to make." The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown, and the meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10. Darnell's attorney was a man named Hartley, who had a reputation for clean settlements and who had prepared his position based on the financial disclosure Darnell had provided, a disclosure that reflected the joint account, the marital property, and the settlement figure Hartley believed closed the matter. He had not received Raymond's counterfiling until Wednesday afternoon. He had spent Wednesday evening reading it. The expression on his face when Jordan and Raymond entered the conference room was the expression of a man who has opened a building's structural plans and found load-bearing walls in places he had not been told to expect them. Darnell was already seated when they entered. He looked the way he always looked in professional settings, composed, well-dressed, positioned in the chair with the ease of a man who expected to leave a room in approximately the same condition as when he entered it. He looked at Jordan the way he had been looking at her for 9 years, with a mild, habitual regard that saw exactly as far as he had ever been interested in seeing. Vivienne Cross was not present. She had. Raymond had confirmed through channels he maintained for exactly this kind of information, declined to attend on the advice of her family's counsel, who had apparently reviewed the counter-filing and made a reasonable assessment of the direction the morning was heading. Hartley opened with a revised framing. His voice carried less of its usual assurance now, and the revision was visible. He described the counter-filing as raising issues that warranted discussion, and he suggested that a revised settlement figure might be appropriate. He did this with the careful language of a man who has realized he needs to find an exit route and is trying to identify one that does not look like a retreat. Raymond, Let him finish. Then Raymond placed the Cole Meridian Holdings corporate history on the table. The founding documents. The incorporation date, 3 years before the marriage, dated and notarized. The 11-year contribution record. The independent valuation. And the lease agreement for the building Darnell's firm had occupied for 6 years, signed by a Cole Meridian subsidiary, renewed 8 months ago by a man who had not recognized the name of the company that owned the space where he spent his working days. Hartley Reed. He set the papers down and looked at Darnell. Darnell looked at the papers and then at Jordan with an expression she recognized. It was the expression she had learned to associate in structural work with the moment a person realizes that the wall they thought was decorative is actually holding the ceiling up. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her in years, with something that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of genuine attention. He said her name. He said he had not understood. He said that if he had known, he would not have, and then he stopped, because he was a man with enough self-awareness to hear how that sentence ended. Hartley attempted a legal argument. Raymond answered it with the premarital establishment date, the independent valuation, and the full 10 years of clean documentation, and the argument did not survive contact with the record. Darnell tried the final mechanism. He looked at her with the warmth he had used in the early years and said, "Jordan, whatever the documents say, you and I built something together. That has to mean something in this room." She looked at him the way her grandfather had taught her to look at any structure she was assessing, without sentiment, asking only what it was built to carry and whether it could still hold. "You spent 9 years in a building that had my name on the deed," she said, in the even voice she used in boardrooms and client meetings and Sunday morning calls with Raymond. "You renewed the lease 8 months ago. You sat in those conference rooms and those lobbies, and you never thought to ask. That is not a failure of information, Darnell. That is a failure of curiosity. And curiosity is the one thing I cannot give you now." She gathered her copy of the documents and stood. "The most dangerous thing a person can do," she said, and she was speaking to him, but she was also, in some private way, speaking to her grandfather, is let someone else measure their value. "I never let you do that. I know that now feels like a disadvantage to you. But it was always the whole point." She walked out. Raymond followed, 2 steps behind. The door closed, without drama. Behind it, the room was very quiet, and Darnell Cole sat at the table with the lease agreement in front of him, the one he had signed 8 months ago without reading the name of the company that owned the building he worked in every day of his professional life. 10 months later, Jordan sat in the new office on the 11th floor of the Cole Meridian building in Midtown, the one she had moved the company into the previous spring, when she decided the company had earned a proper headquarters and she had earned a view of the city she had been building inside of, quietly, for 11 years. The walnut bookshelves had come first. They always came first, wherever she went. The movers had been told they were the priority, and when the boxes were opened, she had arranged them before she unpacked anything else, because her grandfather's photograph and the bound fiscal reports and the graduate engineering texts needed to be in their right place before the rest of the room could find its order. She was reviewing a contract proposal that would take Cole Meridian into a 5th state, a rehabilitation project the size of which would have been, 5 years ago, larger than anything the company had attempted. She had spent 5 years building a team of people who were individually better than her at specific things, and collectively organized around the one thing she was better at than any of them, seeing the full shape of a structure before it existed, reading what it would be required to carry before a single foundation was poured. There was a man named Kofi Mensah, who came to the office on Thursday evenings. He was a corporate architect she had met through a professional referral and who had asked, after their second meeting, whether she might like to have dinner. In the careful way of a man who had thought about how to ask and had decided on directness over strategy. She had said yes. He asked about the company with the kind of genuine curiosity that has no ceiling, the kind that followed her answers into the technical specifics she usually kept for professional settings and waited, without impatience, when she needed to think before she finished a sentence. She had not realized, until she sat across the table from it, how much she had missed being asked a question by someone who actually wanted the answer. Darnell had relocated. Raymond had heard this, as Raymond tended to hear most things that circulated in the professional networks of Atlanta, and had mentioned it without emphasis on a Tuesday call that had been primarily about the Fifth State contract. Darnell was at a smaller firm in a city she had no reason to visit, in a position noticeably below the one he had left. Vivienne Cross's family had withdrawn from further involvement some months after the conference room, which said something about the quality of their institutional judgment, and nothing that needed to be said aloud. The house had sold below its assessed value. The Buckhead jeweler charge had been settled with a secondary card. Jordan registered all of this in the way she registered reports on structures she had already assessed and moved on from, completely without lingering, and then she filed it and returned to what was in front of her. She turned back to the contract proposal on the desk and read it the way her grandfather had taught her to read anything that was going to bear real weight, not for what she wanted it to say, not for what someone else had decided she needed to know, but for what was actually there, in the numbers and the dates and the load figures, which were the only language that had never once misled her. She was solvent. She was free. She was unbothered. She had kept the measurement herself, from the first day to this one. She always had. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.